They thought they were stopping a stranger on the road. They had no idea they were about to question someone who wore the same badge they respected. The afternoon traffic moved quietly along a highway outside Dallas, Texas, as people continued their daily routines without knowing that an ordinary moment was about to reveal an extraordinary lesson. Behind the wheel of a simple sedan was Michael Anderson, a man who appeared like any other driver traveling down the road. He was calm, focused, and dressed in regular clothes. There was no uniform, no visible sign of authority, no reason for anyone passing by to know the responsibility he carried every day. But Michael Anderson was not just another driver. For more than 15 years, he had served his community as a sheriff's deputy. He had spent his career protecting others, responding to difficult situations, and learning what it truly meant to carry a badge. Yet on this day, he was not thinking about his position. He was simply heading home after finishing his duties, enjoying a quiet drive away from the demands of his job. Then, a small issue changed the direction of his afternoon. Two police officers, Daniel Brooks and Kevin Turner, noticed his vehicle and decided to make a traffic stop. From their perspective, it appeared to be a normal situation. A vehicle, a road, a driver they did not recognize. They had no idea who was behind the steering wheel. They did not know about Michael's years of service. They did not know about the people who trusted him. They only saw what was immediately visible. Michael noticed the patrol lights behind him and calmly pulled over. He understood the role of law enforcement because he was part of that world himself. He knew that questions were part of the job. He knew that procedures existed for a reason. So when the officers approached, he remained respectful and cooperative. "Good afternoon, officers," Michael said calmly. His voice carried no anger, no frustration, just patience. Officer Brooks began asking questions while Officer Turner reviewed the situation. First, everything appeared routine. But as the conversation continued, Michael realized something important. The officers did not know who he was, and he decided not to immediately reveal his position. Not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he believed every person deserved to be treated fairly before anyone knew their title. Throughout his career, Michael had learned that a badge was not a symbol of superiority. It was a symbol of responsibility. He believed that respect should not depend on someone's position, background, or influence. It should be given because every person deserves dignity. As the conversation continued on that quiet Texas road, people nearby began noticing the interaction. They saw a calm man answering questions and two officers trying to understand the situation in front of them. Nobody knew the full story yet. Nobody knew that the person they were questioning was someone who had spent years serving the same principles they claimed to protect. And that was what made this moment so powerful. Because sometimes the biggest lessons begin when people do not know who they are standing in front of. Michael Anderson was not looking for special treatment. He was not trying to prove anything. He was simply waiting for the truth to reveal itself. And soon, everyone would discover that the person they thought they understood was someone they had never truly seen before. The quiet Texas highway continued moving around them, but for Michael Anderson, the moment had become a test of something he had believed throughout his entire career. A badge was never meant to create distance between people. It was meant to create responsibility. As Officer Daniel Brooks and Officer Kevin Turner continued asking questions, Michael remained calm and respectful. He answered clearly and gave them the information they requested. He understood the process because he had spent years working within the same world. He knew that officers had duties to perform, and he respected that. But he also understood something that was sometimes forgotten. The person standing in front of a badge was still a person first. Michael had learned that lesson early in his career. Before becoming a sheriff's deputy, he had watched experienced officers handle difficult conversations with patience. He saw that the best leaders were not the ones who needed to prove they had authority. They were the ones who understood when to listen. Those lessons stayed with him every day. That was why he did not immediately mention his position. He wanted the interaction to happen naturally. He wanted to be treated like any other person on the road, not because he wanted to hide who he was, but because he believed fairness should exist before recognition. Officer Brooks looked over the information again while Officer Turner continued observing the situation. From their perspective, they were simply handling a routine traffic stop. But the longer the conversation continued, the more noticeable the difference became between their expectations and Michael's response. Many people became defensive when questioned. Michael did not. Many people tried to prove their importance. Michael did not. Instead, he remained composed, showing the same patience he had practiced throughout years of public service. A few drivers passing by noticed the interaction. They did not hear every word, but they could see the contrast. One man stood quietly beside his vehicle, while two officers tried to understand the situation in front of them. The moment was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was simply a conversation that carried a deeper meaning. Michael looked at the officers and spoke carefully. "I understand you are doing your job," he said. "I only hope every person you meet receives the same patience and respect." The words were simple, but they carried the perspective of someone who had spent years serving a community. Officer Turner briefly looked at Michael's identification information and paused. Something about the name seemed familiar, but he could not immediately place it. He looked again, wondering if there was more to the person standing in front of him than he first realized. Michael noticed the hesitation but said nothing. He allowed the moment to unfold. Throughout his career, he had learned that truth did not always need to be forced. Sometimes it simply needed time to appear. The officers still did not know the full story. They did not know that the person they were questioning had spent years wearing the same symbol of responsibility they carried. They did not know that Michael understood the pressure of their position because he had lived it himself. They only knew what they could see. But soon, they would discover that appearances rarely tell the entire story. And the quiet man standing beside the road was about to reveal a truth that would change the way they viewed the entire encounter. The conversation on the Texas highway continued, but something had started to change. What began as a routine traffic stop was slowly becoming a moment that revealed more about the people involved than anyone expected. Michael Anderson remained beside his vehicle, calm and patient, while officers Daniel Brooks and Kevin Turner continued reviewing the details in front of them. They still saw a driver. They still saw a situation that needed to be handled. But they were beginning to notice something unusual. Michael was not reacting like someone trying to avoid responsibility. He was not searching for an excuse. He was not trying to use influence. He was simply showing the same professionalism they would expect from someone carrying a badge. That was the detail they could not ignore. Throughout his years as a sheriff's deputy, Michael had learned that respect was not something people should receive only after their identity was discovered. It was something that should exist from the very beginning. He had spent countless hours responding to situations where emotions were high and patience was tested. He knew that the first reaction often revealed more about a person than the situation itself. That was why he continued to remain calm. He wanted the moment to be handled with fairness, not because he was powerless, but because he understood the responsibility that came with power. Officer Turner looked at Michael's identification again. The name seemed more familiar now. He searched his memory, trying to understand why. There was something about the way Michael spoke, the way he carried himself, and the way he handled the conversation that felt different. It reminded him of experienced officers he had met before, people who did not need to prove their authority because their professionalism already showed it. "Have we met before?" Turner finally asked. Michael gave a small smile. "I work in law enforcement," he replied. The answer was simple, but it changed the direction of the conversation. Officer Brooks looked over with surprise. "You are an officer?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Yes, I serve as a sheriff's deputy." For a brief moment, the highway became quiet. The information changed the way they looked at the situation. The person they had been questioning was not someone unfamiliar with the responsibilities of their profession. He was someone who understood them personally. But Michael did not use that revelation to make the officers feel embarrassed. He did not raise his voice. He did not remind them of his position. Instead, he continued with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "The important thing is not that I am a deputy," Michael said. "The important thing is how we treat people before we know anything about them." Those words carried a different meaning now. The officers began thinking about the moments before they knew his identity. They thought about how quickly assumptions could form. They thought about how differently people might be treated when their titles were unknown. Nearby, a few people who had been watching the interaction noticed the change in the atmosphere. The situation was no longer about a traffic stop. It had become a lesson about judgment, fairness, and the responsibility carried by anyone with authority. Michael had spent years wearing a badge and understanding what it represented. He knew a badge could open doors, but it could also create expectations. It required patience. It required humility. It required remembering that every person standing in front of you had a story you might never see. And as the officers processed the truth about who Michael was, they realized the biggest lesson was not discovering that he carried a badge. The biggest lesson was understanding that they should have respected the person before they ever knew he did. The moment Michael Anderson revealed that he served as a sheriff's deputy changed the entire meaning of the conversation on the Texas highway. What had started as a simple traffic stop became a moment of reflection for everyone involved. But Michael knew something important. The purpose of the moment was not to prove that he had authority. It was to remind people why authority existed in the first place. Officer Daniel Brooks and Officer Kevin Turner stood quietly, processing everything they had just learned. The person they had viewed as an unfamiliar driver was someone who understood their profession from the inside. Michael knew the responsibility of wearing a badge. He knew the pressure officers faced. He knew that every decision made on the road could influence how people viewed law enforcement as a whole. That was why he never wanted the conversation to become about his position. "I do not want anyone to treat me differently because of my title," Michael explained calmly. "The same respect should be given before someone knows who I am." The statement stayed with both officers, because they realized the most important part of the encounter happened before they knew his identity. Before they knew he was a deputy. Before they knew he carried the same responsibility they carried. It was about the first impression they had created. It was about the assumptions made in those first few minutes. Officer Brooks looked back at the beginning of the stop and remembered how quickly he had formed an opinion. He had focused on the situation in front of him, but he had not considered the person standing there. Michael understood that this was not an easy realization. Nobody liked discovering that they could have handled a situation differently. But he also knew that growth only happened when people were willing to look honestly at themselves. "Every officer has moments where they have to make decisions quickly," Michael said. "The challenge is making sure those decisions are guided by fairness and understanding." Those words represented the kind of leadership Michael had practiced throughout his career. He believed that the strongest professionals were not those who never made mistakes. They were the ones who learned from those moments and became better because of them. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere changed. The officers were no longer simply gathering information. They were listening. They were seeing Michael differently, but more importantly, they were thinking differently about the person they had met before knowing his role. Nearby, people who had watched the interaction noticed the shift. They saw that the situation was not becoming a confrontation. Instead, it was becoming a conversation about responsibility. Michael had every opportunity to use his position to end the situation immediately. He could have focused on the fact that he was a fellow law enforcement officer. But he chose another path. He chose to focus on the principle behind the moment. A badge should never be a reason someone receives respect only after it is recognized. It should be a reminder that respect should exist between people from the beginning. For years, Michael had taught others about professionalism. Now, standing on the side of a Texas highway, he demonstrated that lesson through his actions. The officers had expected to meet an ordinary driver. Instead, they met someone who showed them that true authority was not about having the ability to control a situation. It was about having the wisdom to handle it with fairness. And as the conversation moved forward, everyone began to understand that the biggest lesson was not about who carried the badge. It was about what the badge was supposed to represent. The conversation on the Texas highway continued, but the meaning behind it had changed completely. What began as a routine traffic stop had become a moment where two sides of law enforcement were forced to look at something deeper than a simple interaction. Michael Anderson stood beside his vehicle with the same calm expression he had shown from the beginning. Even after revealing that he was a sheriff's deputy, he carried himself the same way. He did not become louder. He did not become more demanding. He did not use his position to make the situation easier for himself. That was what surprised Officer Daniel Brooks and Officer Kevin Turner the most. They expected a person with authority to focus on proving his importance. Instead, they saw someone focused on the values behind that authority. Michael had spent years learning that leadership was not about making people recognize your position. It was about showing people why that position mattered. A badge was not a symbol that placed one person above another. It was a promise to serve, protect, and act with fairness. Officer Brooks looked back at the interaction from the beginning and began to understand why the moment had affected him. The biggest lesson was not that Michael was a deputy. The biggest lesson was that Michael deserved the same level of respect before anyone knew that. That realization was difficult because it required honest reflection. It required looking beyond intentions and examining the impact of actions. Michael understood that many people believed they were doing the right thing while making decisions based on incomplete information. That was why he chose to speak with patience instead of criticism. Everyone has moments where they have to learn, Michael said. The important thing is what we choose to do after we recognize something needs to improve. The words created a different atmosphere. The officers were no longer simply thinking about the traffic stop. They were thinking about the responsibility that came with their role. Officer Turner asked Michael about his experience in law enforcement. Michael explained that he had spent years working with different communities and different situations. He had learned that trust was built through consistency. People did not judge an organization only by its policies. They judged it by the people representing those policies. That lesson stayed with the officers, because they understood that every interaction had the ability to shape someone's opinion. A person might forget a conversation after a few days, but they often remembered how that conversation made them feel. As the roadside discussion continued, more details about Michael's career became known. He had served his community for years. He had trained younger officers. He had helped others understand the importance of professionalism and patience. Yet, despite everything he had accomplished, he still believed the simplest moments revealed the most about a person. Michael could have turned the situation into a lesson about his own achievements. Instead, he turned it into a lesson about everyone's responsibility. The officers began to see that the person standing before them was not asking for special treatment. He was asking for something much more basic. He was asking for the same fairness that every person deserved. And that was the moment the true meaning of the encounter became clear. The lesson was not about discovering that Michael Anderson carried a badge. The lesson was about remembering that every person carries a story, and the right way to treat someone should never depend on whether that story is known. The Texas highway had returned to its normal rhythm, but the lesson from that afternoon continued long after Michael Anderson and the officers left the roadside. What appeared to be a simple traffic stop had become a moment of reflection for everyone involved. Michael understood that situations like this were rarely about one single conversation. They were about the choices people made in those conversations. They were about how quickly assumptions could form and how important it was to look beyond the first impression. For Officer Daniel Brooks and Officer Kevin Turner, the experience stayed with them because it challenged the way they viewed their own responsibilities. They had always understood that wearing a badge meant following the law and protecting the community. But after meeting Michael, they realized there was another part of the responsibility that was just as important. A badge also represented trust. It represented the relationship between an officer and the people they served. Michael had spent years learning that trust was not built through authority alone. It was built through patience, consistency, and respect. In the days following the encounter, the story reached leaders within the department. The focus was not on creating blame or turning one moment into a public argument. Instead, the focus was on understanding what could be learned. Leaders discussed the importance of treating every person with fairness before knowing their background, profession, or achievements. They understood that a person's title should never be the reason they receive dignity. Dignity should come first. Michael was later asked about the experience, and his response surprised many people. He did not talk about feeling powerful because he was a deputy. He did not talk about proving that he was right. Instead, he talked about improvement. Every person in a position of responsibility has a duty to keep learning, Michael explained. The moment we stop listening is the moment we stop growing. Those words reflected the way he had approached his entire career. He believed the strongest leaders were not those who never faced difficult moments. They were the ones who used those moments to become better. Officer Brooks and Officer Turner also reflected on what they could take from the experience. They realized that the most important part of professionalism was not only knowing procedures. It was understanding the people affected by those procedures. They thought about how differently the conversation might have gone if Michael had immediately announced his position. The entire situation might have changed in seconds. But then they would have missed the deeper lesson. They would have learned that respect should never appear only after someone's importance becomes visible. The experience became a reminder that every person carries something others cannot immediately see. A person may carry years of service, personal struggles, achievements, or responsibilities hidden behind ordinary appearances. Michael had shown that true confidence did not require proving who he was. His actions had already revealed his character before anyone knew his title. As the story continued to spread among those who heard about it, people focused less on the traffic stop itself and more on what it represented. It became a reminder that authority should always be connected to humility. It became a reminder that professionalism was measured not only by what rules people followed, but also by how they treated others while following them. And for everyone who witnessed the encounter, one message remained clear. The most important thing about a person is not always what can be seen immediately. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the moments when people take the time to truly understand who is standing in front of them. The impact of the roadside encounter continued to grow, not because of what happened during those few minutes, but because of what people learned afterward. For Michael Anderson, the experience became another reminder of the responsibility that came with serving the public. For the department, it became an opportunity to look deeper into the meaning of trust and accountability. The conversation was no longer only about one traffic stop. It became a larger discussion about how authority should be used and how every person should be treated before their story is fully known. Inside the department, leaders began reviewing the situation carefully. They understood that strong organizations were not built by ignoring uncomfortable moments. They were built by having the courage to examine them. Every interaction between an officer and a member of the community represented something bigger than that single encounter. It represented the values behind the badge. Officer Daniel Brooks thought about that as he continued his work. The experience with Michael changed the way he viewed everyday situations. He realized that professionalism was not only about knowing the rules. It was also about understanding the people affected by those rules. A person could follow every procedure and still miss the most important part of the job, which was seeing the humanity of the person standing in front of them. Officer Kevin Turner reached a similar understanding. He remembered the moment when Michael revealed that he was a sheriff's deputy. The information had changed the atmosphere immediately, but the deeper lesson was what happened before the reveal. Before anyone knew Michael's title, he was still the same person. He still deserved patience. He still deserved fairness. He still deserved respect. That was the part that stayed with them. Michael was later invited to speak with community members and other public servants about leadership and responsibility. He did not use the experience as a way to criticize individuals. Instead, he used it as a way to encourage improvement. He explained that every person in a position of authority would eventually face moments where their character was tested. Leadership is not shown by how quickly you can control a situation, Michael said. Leadership is shown by how carefully you handle a situation when you have the ability to choose your response. Those words reflected the way Michael had approached the entire encounter. He had the ability to make the moment about himself, but he chose to make it about a bigger lesson. He wanted people to understand that fairness should not depend on recognition. It should not depend on a person's career, title, or achievements. It should exist because every individual deserves to be treated with dignity. As the story reached more people, many focused on the unexpected discovery that the driver was a sheriff's deputy. But Michael believed the most important part was something else. The real lesson was not that he carried a badge. The real lesson was that everyone carries something others cannot immediately see. A person may be a leader, a professional, a caregiver, or someone facing challenges that remain hidden from view. The responsibility of others is to approach each person with enough patience to discover the truth. The highway where the encounter began eventually became just another road again. The traffic continued. The days moved forward. But for those who knew what happened there, the location represented something more. It represented a moment when assumptions were challenged and understanding took their place. And the lesson remained simple. A badge can show a person's responsibility, but it is their actions that reveal their character. The lesson from the Texas highway continued to reach people far beyond the original moment. What began as a simple encounter between a driver and two officers became a reminder that every interaction carries meaning. For Michael Anderson, the experience did not change who he was. He continued serving his community with the same dedication, humility, and professionalism that had guided him for years. But for those who heard the story, the encounter revealed something important about leadership and responsibility. Michael understood that moments of difficulty could become opportunities for growth. He believed that people should not only ask what happened, but also ask what could be learned from it. That mindset had shaped his entire career as a sheriff's deputy. He had seen many situations where the first impression did not tell the complete story. He had learned that patience created understanding, and understanding created trust. In the weeks after the encounter, conversations continued among community members and law enforcement professionals. Many people focused on the unexpected discovery that the quiet driver was actually a deputy with years of experience. But Michael continued reminding others that the most important part of the story happened before anyone knew his position. The true measure of fairness was not how people treated someone after learning their achievements. It was how they treated that person before knowing anything about them. Officer Daniel Brooks carried that lesson with him. He began thinking differently about the role of an officer. He realized that every person encountered during a shift represented more than just a situation to handle. Each person was an individual with a history, a family, and experiences that were not immediately visible. Officer Kevin Turner shared that reflection. He understood that authority came with a responsibility to remain open-minded. A badge could provide the ability to enforce rules, but it could never replace the importance of listening and understanding. Michael later spoke with other public servants about the importance of character. He explained that difficult moments often reveal what people truly value. When circumstances become challenging, people have a choice. They can focus on defending themselves, or they can focus on finding a better way forward. Michael believed the strongest leaders chose the second path. A person's character is revealed when they have the opportunity to choose how they respond, he said. That choice matters more than any title they carry. His message connected with many because it was not only about law enforcement. It applied to workplaces, communities, and everyday relationships. Everyone has moments where they interact with someone they do not fully understand. The question is whether they approach that moment with assumptions or with curiosity. The story of Michael Anderson and the officers became a reminder that people are often much more than what others see at first glance. A person who appears ordinary may carry years of service. A quiet voice may belong to someone with great responsibility. A simple conversation may reveal a lesson that lasts much longer than the moment itself. Michael never wanted the encounter remembered because he was a sheriff's deputy. He wanted it remembered because it showed the importance of treating people with dignity before their identity became known. And as the message continued spreading, one truth remained clear. The greatest form of leadership is not having the power to change a situation. It is having the wisdom to use that power in a way that helps others understand, learn, and grow. The road where Michael Anderson's unexpected encounter began eventually became just another stretch of highway in Texas. The vehicles continued passing, the days continued moving forward, And most people who traveled that road never knew that a simple conversation there had created a lesson about fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of true leadership. But for those who experienced it, the memory remained. Michael continued his work as a sheriff's deputy with the same quiet dedication he had always shown. He never viewed the moment as a chance to gain attention or prove that he was important. In his mind, the experience was not about revealing his position. It was about revealing a principle. A person should not have to prove their value before they receive respect. That belief had guided Michael throughout his career, and it became the message he shared whenever people asked about what happened. He explained that every person carries a story that may not be visible at first glance. Some people carry years of service. Some carry personal challenges. Some carry responsibilities that others may never know about. The only way to understand those stories is to approach people with patience and fairness. Officer Daniel Brooks and Officer Kevin Turner also continued forward, but the encounter changed the way they viewed their daily responsibilities. They understood that every interaction was an opportunity to represent the values behind their badges. They learned that professionalism was not only measured by how well someone followed procedures. It was also measured by how well someone treated the people affected by those procedures. The experience reminded them that authority and humility had to exist together. Without humility, authority could create distance. With humility, authority could create trust. As time passed, the story reached more members of the community. Many expected the focus to be on the moment when Michael's identity became known. But Michael always redirected the conversation. He believed the most important part happened before anyone knew he was a deputy. That was when the real choice was made. Would people judge a stranger based only on what they saw, or would they take the time to understand the person standing in front of them? That question became the heart of the lesson. Michael had spent years wearing a badge, but he understood that a badge alone did not define a person. Actions defined a person. Choices defined a person. Character defined a person. The encounter showed that real authority was not about having the ability to end a conversation quickly or use a position to gain advantage. Real authority was about having the wisdom to choose patience when impatience would be easier. It was about choosing understanding when assumptions were available. It was about choosing fairness when nobody expected anything from you. In the end, the lesson from that Texas highway was not about a traffic stop. It was not about a title. It was not about discovering who had the most authority. It was about something much simpler and much more powerful. Every person deserves to be seen as a person before they are seen as anything else. Because the greatest test of character is not how someone treats those whose importance is already known. It is how they treat those whose stories have not yet been discovered. And that was the truth Michael Anderson left behind. The strongest leaders do not need to announce who they are. Their actions speak before their names ever do.